Hello and welcome to another episode of A Rough Sketch of History. This episode is Inferno, or the summary of the First World War prior to the Meuse Argonne offensive. The purpose of this video is to give context to people who maybe aren't familiar with the events of the First World War, to kind of understand the stakes and the situation of which the events of the Meuse Argonne occurred. This is a huge topic that I'm giving just the absolute bare bones to. I'll be focusing almost entirely on Europe, even though it was a worldwide conflict. But this will at least give you enough of the context to be able to place the Meuse Argonne and to understand the wider scope. So with that said, let's move to our rough sketch of history map. I did make a few changes of it, partly because I had started a video and had some technical difficulties, but I'll explain them as we go along. It won't be too disruptive. Let me quickly explain the countries involved here. We have Russia, Imperial Russia, not yet a communist nation, Romania, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, which is just a small portion of, most of it would be in the Middle East, Greece, Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, France, the United Kingdom, and the neutral nations of Spain, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway and Sweden, which were impacted by the war but not directly combatants in the war. As the war would progress, there would be two alliances that would be formed. We would have the Central Powers, which I'm indicating with colors here, and the Entente, or the Allied Powers, and that the sides fighting would fall into one group or the other eventually. Yeah, I'll move that up a bit. Now, though we covered this in the last video, we'll just do a real quick rundown for those who maybe didn't watch it, or just to be a brief refresher. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo. Austria-Hungary gives an ultimatum to Serbia to a list of demands. Serbia refuses. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. As an ally of Serbia, Russia mobilizes its military. This makes Germany feel that it is under threat, so it preemptively declares war on Germany. The reason why is because it believed that it would inevitably end up in a war with France and Germany and Russia at the same time, which it didn't believe it could win, and because it knew that Russia would take weeks to mobilize its army, whereas France would only take days. It quickly declares war on France and invades through Belgium to avoid the fortified border between France and Germany. Hoping to defeat France in time to turn its armies east to face Russia. So they invade through Belgium. This brings Great Britain into the war. So you can see I have the colors here of Serbia, Montenegro, France, Russia, Belgium, and Great Britain. At this point only we have the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany. And this is at the point in the video where I had the technical problems. So that's catching you up here. So Germany ends up invading through Belgium. Eventually a combined British, French, and Belgian army stops the French, or the advance. And again, this map isn't good to scale, but Germany occupied almost all of Belgium. Only a small sliver of it remained independent, and pushed deep into France, almost capturing Paris, and then eventually being pushed back. So they went deeper and pushed back. At this point, the front line solidifies, and this becomes known as the Western Front, where much of the fighting of the war will be. However, this movement will not change much. This fighting line will not move much throughout the course of the war. So in this process, Germany entered through Belgium. Through the occupation of Belgium, it became known what was known as the Rape of Belgium. The German army committed many atrocities against Belgian civilians, and there was wanton destruction of Belgian cultural sites, and along with what could only really be described as murder to intimidate the local population. At the beginning of the war, there was worldwide kind of mixed sentiment over who was the aggressor, who was the who were the victims, and who were the aggressors. This really soured international views towards Germany. Austria-Hungary at the same time invades Serbia. The battle does not go well, even though the smaller Serbian army is smaller. It pretty handily defeats the invading Austrian army. Also, the Austrian army committing, again, numerous atrocities in Serbia. Serbia would suffer gravely throughout the war, by the end of the war losing a quarter of its male population between war, starvation, and what we would call crimes against humanity. This action made it very difficult for the Central Powers to try to gain allies' sympathy and support throughout the war. So while Germany was invading into France, there was an unexpected action that happened in Eastern Germany. The Russian army formed much quicker than anyone had expected, and it invaded into Germany. As I had mentioned in the other video, almost all of the German army was fighting in France. There was only a small army left to defend this border. They didn't think that that would be a place where fighting would be happening. And to essentially everyone's shock and surprise, through a series of highly successful maneuvers, the small German army surrounded and completely destroyed the Russian invading force. At this same time, Austria-Hungary has invaded into Russia, and I guess would only be considered a dash and bravado in hopes of taking Russian territory and expanding their own empire. Initially, this was met with success, but then the Austro-Hungarian forces end up collapsing and fall back deep into Austria-Hungary, where Russia ends up invading into Austria-Hungary, I think close to 100 miles. It was a devastating loss for Austria-Hungary, which at this point had made a fairly terrible showing in the war, unable to defeat the small nation of Serbia and being in full rout by the Russian army. In reaction to these events, the United Kingdom, though it has a small army, has a massive navy. It forms a blockade across Germany and forbids imports of anything that they deem supporting Germany's war effort. And since soldiers eat, one of the things that were blockaded was food. This would have severe repercussions throughout the war, and hundreds of thousands of Germans would eventually die because of starvation and malnutrition by the end of the war. It's not on the map here, but we'll see that eventually the Ottoman Empire does join the war on the side of the Central Powers, primarily because, as I discussed in the other video, that they had ordered 2 battleships to be built by Great Britain to sell. They had already been bought and paid for. When the battleships were completed, Great Britain said we needed these for the war, and that if they survived the war, you could have them then. This was deeply insulting to the Ottoman Empire, who had been in secret talks with both Great Britain and Germany. Great Britain trying to keep them out of the war, Germany trying to convince them to join the war. And because of Germany's, at this point, rather successful invasion into France, they did almost capture Paris. They completely destroyed the Russian army. It seemed like Germany was probably going to come out on top on this war, and wanting to be on the side of the winners, the Ottoman Empire joins the war. At this point, the Ottoman Empire sort of controlled Egypt, but it also was sort of under the control of Great Britain. That's a complicated thing. But at this point, Great Britain seizes all control of Egypt, and that there would be fighting along the Sinai Peninsula, though that'll be kind of off of the European scale, so I won't go too much detail into that as we go on. In addition to being cut off from the north, the French Navy cuts off this little gate here, not permitting Austria-Hungary to do imports either. So now we come into 1915. I know I've really glossed over this, but some of the most destructive months in the war were the first few months. Nobody really saw this war coming. At this point, there are literally hundreds of thousands of casualties in just a few months. Everybody thought the war would be over quickly. That's you often hear the refrain, the war will be over by Christmas. In regards to the First World War, by the start of 1915, everybody knew this war was going to go on for a while. So all of their strategies and tactics would have been to be hyper-aggressive, to push quickly, to end the war quickly, needed to change. And they were now trying to find ways to get an advantage in what would be a much longer war. The British and the French launched several offensives in 1915 to try to push the Germans out of France and Belgium. These failed and incurred huge casualties with little success. Literally, at times the Germans would only retreat a couple hundred of yards at the expense of thousands or tens of thousands of lives. The Germans introduced what would become a hallmark of the war in 1915. They introduced chemical warfare, first using chlorine gas. I'll talk more about chemical warfare in detail in another video, so I won't go into it here, but it became one of the most iconic, destructive, and horrifying aspects of the war. In 1915 on the Eastern Front, as you remember, Russia's army had been smashed by the Germans, but the Southern Russian army was deep in Austria-Hungary, and Austria-Hungary was literally on the verge of collapse. Once the spring came and the weather improved, Germany essentially, its high command co-opted the Austro-Hungarian army. It never really operated as an independent army for the rest of the war. They just did not have the capability to do this. And a joint German and Austro-Hungarian army invades into Russia, and what happens is known as the Great Retreat. The Russian army, though it does inflict huge casualties on both sides, it wasn't a one-way fight. It essentially collapses and ends up retreating deep into Russia. By the time the offensive in the spring and summer is over, the front line is more like here. This is very roughly speaking. And this is kind of where it would be for the remainder of the war. It would seesaw back and forth, sometimes getting as far as here, sometimes being pushed back. Unlike the Western Front, which stayed static for most of the war, this front would move tens, if not hundreds of miles at periods of time, seesawing back and forth. The thing being that this is a very sparsely populated, or relatively to Western Europe, sparsely populated area. It's very flat, no mountains, no forests. So even though huge tracts of lands were going back and forth, not much of anything of significance was being exchanged. So in some ways, even though the scope of the movement was higher, the effect on the war was minimal. So a lot of the First World War can be summed up by lots of fighting for lots of gains. In the meantime, off of the map, Turkey, or the Ottoman Empire, on their shared border with Russia, was engaged in offensive operations trying to invade the Caucasus region. This went terribly for them. So after a bit of back and forth, the Kingdom of Italy, decides to side with the Entente. This is kind of an unexpected move. Both Germany and Austria are very angry with Italy because they were essentially allies before the war. Though after the initial successes of Germany, I think it became pretty clear to the Italians that there were just, as you can see, just too many countries against the Central Powers. The war may go for a long time, but they were going to lose. They wanted to be in on the winning side. There were territories that Austria-Hungary held that they wouldn't mind having. So they launched an offensive into Austria-Hungary. Now, Austria-Hungary had done a pretty terrible job fighting for a good chunk of the war, but they actually were quite successful against the Italians. The main reason being is that this region they were fighting in was very mountainous, and the Austria-Hungarian army was not a very competent army in a lot of ways. Its soldiers were often not very well motivated. But the other thing is that many of the soldiers of the Austro-Hungarians were Slavic, which fighting against fellow Slavs in Serbia and in Russia was difficult for them. They didn't really have any qualms about fighting Italians. And it being a defensive war up in the mountains where they had the terrain on their side, there would be a huge conflict on this border. But again, it would not move much throughout the war. It would stay pretty close to the actual borders of the nations. So Austria-Hungary in 1915 continued to invade Serbia and continued to fail. Eventually, what ends up happening is that the Austro-Hungarian forces would receive reinforcements from Germany, and they would also induce Bulgaria to join them in the war. And they would eventually push through and conquer all of Serbia and divide it up amongst the Bulgarian and Austro-Hungarian armies. The Serbian army retreats into Albania, which was kind of neutral, but was also having so many internal struggles that it was almost in a state of anarchy. So having the Serbian army move through it didn't help matters at all. It was evacuated by the Allied navies and moved into somewhat neutral Germany or Greece, and we'll go more into that as we get closer to it. In the Middle East, fighting between Great Britain, which had holdings in the area and had a navy capable of moving around in those areas. They land forces in Kuwait, which was a protectorate of the Great Britain. And fighting begins in Mesopotamia, which is modern-day Iraq. Again, off map, but it is relevant. Using their navies, Great Britain and Great Britain and France end up landing forces at Gallipoli, which is kind of around here, and on the other side of the strait. This is known as the Turkish Strait. It was very important that after the Ottomans joined the war, they closed the strait to Russian shipping, which left Russia in desperate need of anything which needed to be imported. And at this point, Russia was not an industrialized country at all. Much of their weapons, much of industrial supplies, mechanical items, vehicles had to be imported. They couldn't be imported through the Baltic Sea because of the German Navy. Now they were blocked here, and you could go around north, but the ports in the north are often closed in with ice much of the year, and it was a difficult sailing route. So this was putting a stranglehold on Russia. Part of why they had to fall back so deeply. There were issues of their men not having enough ammunition, not having enough rifles. The idea was that they would take control of this area, they would reclaim the strait, shipping could move through, and eventually the idea being that their forces could invade into Turkey or into Constantinople, the capital, and push the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and Russia could receive supplies and they would not have to worry about them anymore. It was a good idea in theory. In fact, it turned out to be an abysmal failure. Here we come now into 1916. Not much changes on the Western Front. There are huge battles. Chemical weapons are being used on both sides, though not much is changing. The stranglehold on Germany from its being blockaded is really starting to have an effect. And oh, I do need to go back to 1915 real quickly. There was a brief period where the German Navy used its submarines in what they called unrestricted warfare, or submarine warfare, which was to sink ships carrying cargo into Great Britain. They wanted to essentially make a blockade themselves of Great Britain, being an island nation, to starve them out the same way that Great Britain was trying to starve Germany. But unlike simply blockading, they were doing this by sinking transport ships. One of the ships that were sunk was the Lusitania. It was a passenger ship, and 128 Americans who were on the ship died. Under pressure from the United States diplomatic pressure, the Germans ceased this practice. So sorry about that. We come now back into so that was 1915. We're back into 1916. In 1916, with the submarine option off the table, they tried to break the stranglehold of the British Navy by trying to lure part of it into part of the North Sea where they would have an advantage. What ended up happening was the Battle of Jutland. This was the largest naval battle in modern history, both in the terms of number of ships and the total tonnage or the size of the ships. Nothing like that has really happened. There were a couple of battles in World War II that come very close, but it was one of the largest naval battles in human history. It ended up actually being, like much of the war to this point, indecisive. The Germans did a little bit better in the battle, but they weren't able to break the British Navy, so in the end it was the stalemate resumes. The winter of, because the blockade couldn't be broken, the winter of 1916 to 1917 is known as the Turnip Winter in Germany. Starvation became a very serious issue. With so many soldiers in the field, there weren't as many farmers. There was also a poor harvest, and people essentially lived almost entirely or subsidized their diet very much with turnips. Now, turnips were usually used to feed pigs in Germany and weren't considered much of a delicacy. Malnutrition becomes a very serious issue. On the Eastern Front, the Russians can launch a huge offensive. It did push the Germans back, which was, again, like I said, it would go back and forth. It was successful in pushing the Germans back. It was one of the things that many of the battles that we would see throughout the war, though it achieved minimally its objective, the cost in lives and material was so high that it was not really, or arguably not worth the pressure or the what was gained. But it did have one at its benefit, though, that, find the right color here, that Romania, which had been neutral up to this point, was impressed enough by the Russians that it decided to join the Entente. Now, Romania was not a superpower by any means, but it opened up the front that the Austrians and the Germans would have more territory they would have to fight along with the Bulgarians. And at this point, both sides were desperate for any edge they could get. So, now down into the Balkans, we come back to there, that the Serbian army is evacuated into Greece. The Greek situation becomes very chaotic. The parliament and the elected side of the government, the prime minister, favored the allies and invited allied troops to come into Greece. So Serbian, French, British troops start to come into Greece. However, the monarchy was pro-German and declared that it was neutral and would not have an impact in the war. So for a time, there were two governments in Greece, one at war with the Central Powers, another one at peace with the Central Powers. Going back to Italy again, fighting continues, but no change. Towards the end of 1916, the fighting in Gallipoli and in the Turkish Straits is unable to secure them, and they have to withdraw and retreat from the Ottomans. and fighting in this region ceases for the remainder of the war. 1917 comes into play. The turnip winter put a lot of pressure on Germany. The war had been this slogging stalemate. They were desperate to find a way to break the conflict. Germany, if this was simply a war of attrition, eventually the Allies had more people, had more resources, they would lose. So, as a bit of a desperate gamble, they tried to take some risks. One of them was that they resumed submarine warfare against Great Britain, trying to starve it out. And they also, by doing this, they realized they risked a war with the United States. But the United States, contrary to today, had almost no army of any significance. And it was also across the Atlantic Ocean. The Germans figured that if the United States did want to get in the war, that by the time they could actually get involved in the war in any significant way, the submarines would have choked off Great Britain, and they would have already sued for peace. Then they could have smashed France, and the war would be over before the U.S. could get involved. They wanted to hedge their bets with this, and they reached out to the government in Mexico with something that was known later as the Zimmerman telegraph. It was this coded telegraph was intercepted by the British. It was handed over to the Americans. It was later confirmed by the Germans, but it reached out to Mexico. There was also a similar telegraph that it referenced that was also found to be true that reached out to Japan. And though Japan has not been mentioned at this point, Japan actually was fighting on behalf of the Allies and was fighting in Asia and also providing naval support in the Mediterranean. But they offered Japan U.S. territory, or hinted that U.S. territory could be turned over to them in exchange for their support during the war. And Mexico specifically was told that the territories that the United States had taken in the American-Mexican War of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona would be awarded to Mexico after the war was over if Mexico declared war on the United States. I'm not entirely sure if the Germans really thought they would do this, or if it was just a gamble that maybe they might. I think the hope was that if Mexico did cause a conflict with the United States would be so busy with this that they would stay out of Europe until Germany could win the war. I have no doubt the Germans had no intent of the Americans finding out about this discussion. Mexico and Japan refused Germany's offer, and between this action and the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and on top of the fact that over the years Germany had a list of war crimes and terrible actions towards civilians during the war, that anti-German sentiment was high in the United States, and in conjunction the United States declares war on Germany. Interestingly enough, it doesn't declare war on Austria-Hungary or the Ottoman Empire, but just Germany. So now the United States is in the war, but as I said, the United States didn't have much of a military that could play much of a role. So it would be some time before it became involved. Again, on 1917, on the Western Front, there were another series of huge offensives. They went terribly for the Allies, and it became so bad that there began to be mutinies amongst French troops, refusing to go on further offensive operations. Interestingly enough, the mutinies, the troops didn't abandon their positions. They would defend their positions, but they were refusing orders to go on the attack. It was quite a scandal. Eventually, the government did compromise. At the same time, there were some of the most vocal people involved in the mutinies were executed. But they did take steps to improve soldier morale, and with one hand, while on the other hand, cracking down on any further dissent. At this point, there becomes a new front that forms. It sort of formed gradually and unintentionally, since Greece wasn't really involved in the war, but it kind of got dragged in. Eventually, The Greek king is exiled, and the government is unified under the son of the king, and Greece officially declares war on Germany, and this becomes known as the Macedonian Front, and fighting goes on between quite a variety of allied forces: Serbian, Greek, French, Italian, British, against, again, another mixture of Bulgarian, Austria-Hungarian, German soldiers. So now we have another major front. So to kind of review where the major fighting is going on, we have the Western Front, the Italian Front, the Eastern Front, and now the Macedonian Front. The pressure that the war put on Russia is immense. In March of 1917, a revolution breaks out, and the monarchy is toppled, and a provisional government is established that attempts to transition Russia from a absolute despot monarchy to a democratic republic government. Now, it's interesting that we don't really think about this, but this is March of 1917. The United States declares war in April. One of the huge things the United States was hung up on was that when it comes to tyrannical governments, the Russian monarchy essentially had every other nation in Europe beat. And it was a hard sell for people who wanted to join the war in the United States to say we'll be fighting on the sides of despotic Russia. That was something many Americans were uncomfortable with. Now with the Tsar out of power and a new democratic, or at least attempting to move to a democratic government, this sell of this is a fight between authoritarian states and democratic states is easier to make. Russia does remain in the war during this period. The provisional government struggles to keep its country together and struggles to keep fighting against the Germans and the Austrians. The Germans and the Germans specifically try to sow further chaos in Russia by smuggling in an exiled revolutionary by the name of Vladimir Lenin. I'm sure you're familiar with that name. He was smuggled into, I believe, into Finland, which was part of Russia at the time. And he begins to attempt a communist revolution of his own. So this communist revolution is trying to topple the revolutionary installed provisional government. And as you can imagine, having two simultaneous revolutions going on at the same time is chaotic. And in something that is far too complicated to take on in this video, I'll simply say that by that November, the communists have taken power, the provisional government collapses, and the Soviet Union, or at least what would become the Soviet Union, becomes established. A civil war breaks out in Russia, and the new communist government signs a peace treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And it agrees to give up what's known as the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, ceding essentially all of this territory here. So this is roughly where the line ended up being, even though they had been pushed back some and gone back and forth. All of this territory, much of the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, modern-day Poland, Ukraine, all of these were ceded to Russia or German control. And fighting on the Eastern Front essentially stops. Being in a bind here, now all of these forces that have been fighting with the support with the Romanians didn't have Russian support anymore, and the end of 1917 into early 1918, Romania collapses and is forced to surrender. So at this point, I guess I can mark these out. So Serbia, Montenegro, Russia, and Romania have all been knocked out of the war. So here we are coming up into 1918. And it's funny because the war only has less than a year left. But the outcome is far from certain. Belgium is also, for all intents and purposes, knocked out of the war. If you were to look at the map now and kind of see, well, who was standing and who had been knocked out, the Central Powers were doing quite well. And they had the advantage now that there had been a massive fight. The two fronts, the two major fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front, were comparable in size. It wasn't like one was a sideshow to the other. So now there were hundreds of thousands of trained, experienced German troops that now no longer had to be fighting. To be sure, plenty of German troops did stay in the Eastern Front, simply because it wasn't sure what the communist government would do long term. They were trying to pacify this region, and there was a civil war going on. It certainly was not a stable place, but major fighting had stopped. So, for the first time in the war, we are about to see something change very dramatically now coming into 1918 on the Western Front. For the first time in years, the Germans now had more troops on the Western Front than the Allies did. They had also developed a new system of combat. They implemented tactics known as stormtrooper tactics, or probably more technically be called infiltration tactics, which relied instead of on brute force and massive artillery barrages, put an emphasis on speed and surprise, and soldiers operating in small independent units. The Entente had a difficulty struggling with this, and for the first time in years, this line moved, and the Germans pushed deep into France. Now, it's hard to stress at this point because we think of Germany as being the loser in this war. It's hard to stress how close run of a thing it was. We often are more familiar with World War II, which was kind of had a more set narrative to it. That at a certain point it was clear that the Allies would win. It just was a matter of when, what the cost would be. But in the First World War, it was not at all clear who was going to win the war right up to the end. At this point, if you were to take a look at it, you probably would guess that Germany was probably going to be the winner. They had knocked out a series of nations. This new offensive had broken through the deadlock of the Western Front. And here we are, Germany on the cusp of victory before the United States has been able to get involved in any serious way. There were American troops in France at this point. They were not well trained, still under-equipped. They did make a good account of themselves during the German offensives, though the lion's share of the fighting was done by the French and the British. But they were actually able to stop this offense. They became close to Paris yet again, but almost in a replay of 1914, the German offense peters out, and the summer ends, and this is where we start to come up to the point of the Meuse Argonne. At this point, France's last gamble was played. They essentially put the cards on the table and they lost their hand. For all of the victories that they had had, for all the success leading up to this point, this was where they put their resources. And at this point, the cream of the German army was gone. Between casualties, there was simply no, unlike 1914, where conscription hadn't been put into place yet, there was nobody left to draft. Every man, even male, young man, old man, who could possibly be in the military was essentially already in the military. And here Germany was overextended and not able to push the war any further. So now there's a bit of a panic that starts to happen in Germany. What happens now? The Allies want to take advantage of this. They catch their breath from the German offenses in the spring, and they start to put together a plan. They have the creatively named Plan 1919, which was for a massive buildup of American, French, and British forces that would push through the now weakened Germans into Germany itself and end the war. And to set the stage for this next spring offensive, they launched a counteroffensive to retake as much territory as they could against a weakened Germany, not to give it the opportunity. not to give it the opportunity to catch its breath. And that takes us, and I hope you're able to follow us, but that takes us up to the moments prior to the Meuse Argonne offensive. To put things into perspective, just a summary, essentially all of the hopes of winning the war now are pinned on the Western Front. The Italian front has not moved in years. The Macedonian front is stable. If the war is to be stabilized, if the war is to be won, it's to be won here. And the Meuse Argonne was part of an American operation, would have been right about here, to attack the southern part of the bulge into French territory, as the British, who were in the north, the French, who essentially were everywhere else, and then a smaller American force pushing up through the bottom to try to push back this line as far as they could in 1918, and hopefully in the spring of 1919 launch an offensive into Germany itself. That's not how history panned out, and we'll cover that more in detail. I do thank you for listening to this. I do want to give the disclaimer that don't feel like if this is filling up a teacup with a fire hose, a lot of information. Don't feel like you have to necessarily follow everything, but you do have, at least now, the basic building blocks of the events of the war, sufficient to kind of give the context. If there was one thing I'd say to walk away from this video would be that coming up to the Meuse Argonne, the battles have been fought all over Europe and all over the world. Millions have died at this point. And there really was no end in sight. There was a sense now that the tide had turned, but the war was considered far from over, and history would take very unexpected changes in the next months, which would bring a rapid conclusion to the war, and the Meuse Argonne played a pivotal role in that action. And with that, we will discuss more on that moving forward. Thank you.